Welcome back to the video, welcome back to the series, and welcome back to my channel. My name's Charles Bryant, and today we're going to talk about exposure. What is exposure? Well, basically exposure in photography is the balance between light and dark. You mix them together, and in the middle you have perfection. Hopefully, that's what we're trying to achieve. So, there are three factors that contribute to how much light enters the camera. And those are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, or some people say film speed. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is aperture. Well, what is aperture? People hear that term all the time, and a lot of people aren't really familiar or even know what it is. The aperture is like the pupil of your eye. It will open and close to allow certain amounts of light to hit the sensor of the camera, or your retina. All right, now the aperture is measured in stops, or f-stops. You've probably heard that term too. Now listen up, because this is going to get a little confusing. The larger the diameter of the aperture, the smaller the f-stop number. For instance, an f2 or an f2.8 is going to be a large aperture opening. If you go all the way to the other end, where you have an f-stop of f16 or an f22, that aperture is actually going to get really, really tiny, almost like a pinhole. Now, think about that for just a minute. Which f-stop is going to allow the most light? If you said the f-stop with the lowest number, pat yourself on the back, because you are a smart person and you've been listening and taking your notes. With that being said, not every lens is going to allow you to get the aperture settings that I just discussed. So don't get discouraged if you don't have a f1.4. Use the aperture settings that you have to your lens and use them and learn from them. So now we're going to talk about shutter speed, or the shutter of the camera. What is a shutter? What a shutter is it is a shield that protects the sensor of the camera. It opens and closes to allow light to enter the sensor. Now that you know what a shutter is, we're going to go over shutter speed. And shutter speed is basically how fast the shutter opens and closes. Pretty simple. And it is not as confusing as the aperture. It makes sense. Slower the shutter speed, the slower it opens and closes. If it's moving slower, then you're going to allow more light in. The faster the shutter speed, the quicker it opens and closes, and the least amount of light is going to come in. Now, moving on to the last one, we're going to talk about film speed, or ISO or ISO. But some people are going to call it film speed, some people are going to call it ISO or ISO. Doesn't matter. It's all basically the same thing. It is the sensitivity of the sensor. How sensitive is that sensor to light? Just like with shutter speed, this makes perfect sense. The lower the number of the film speed, the less sensitive it is to light. The higher the number of the film speed, or ISO, the more sensitive it is to light. All right, change of scenery. Now, in order to solidify what we've learned today, I figured, why not come outside? So let's recap. We already know what aperture is, we know what shutter and shutter speed is, and we know what ISO is, and we know how their functionality is directly related to how much light enters into the camera. Now, in order to really understand how that works, I figured, why not come to the park and let's find something to shoot. All right, so to start off with, we're in manual mode, and I'm going to go ahead and choose the ISO setting of 400. And the reason for that is because most DSLR cameras can handle that without introducing digital noise. Plus, it's a beautiful day out, it's nice sunshine. And if you don't know what digital noise is, that's basically when the camera sensor can't handle it and it starts to get really grainy, maybe pixelated, and sometimes looks soft and out of focus. Looking back on this LCD panel, you're going to see some settings back there. Now, every camera is different, but on my camera, the ISO is at 400. This is the setting right here. This tells me what my ISO setting is. Right here is where my aperture setting, or my f-stop, is. And right here is where my shutter speed setting is. Now, this little guy right here is called the exposure meter. Now, right in the middle, that's where it's going to be properly exposed, okay? That's what you're shooting for. And if I click and focus on this thing real quick, it's so overexposed that it's not even registering on the scale. Now, anything in the positive is going to be overexposed. Anything to the negative of this white mark is going to be underexposed, okay? Now, for the sake of just getting exposure correct in this video, I'm not going to worry about should I adjust the aperture or should I adjust the shutter speed. That'll come when we get into composition, okay? So for starters, I'm just going to start fooling with the shutter speed. I'm going to start racking it up a little bit higher and see what happens. That little tick mark is starting to show up. So if we keep racking it, you can see it move down where it gets closer towards the middle. And there we go. All right, so that is where the camera is saying that this is properly exposed, and we are at a shutter speed of 320 with an aperture of 5.0. All right, so now that we've got a little bit better subject to photograph, let's go ahead and try adjusting the aperture instead of the shutter speed. So I left the ISO at 400, the shutter speed at 1/25, and these guys are continuously moving out of frame. So let's go ahead and rack the aperture down a little bit. As you can tell, that meter is almost right in the middle. And there we go. Properly exposed. We can go ahead and take the shot. For what it's worth, we got it properly exposed. And anyway, we had an aperture setting of aperture f11, 1/25 of shutter speed, and ISO 400. So, how'd you do? Do you feel like you've learned something today? Well, I hope so, because if you haven't, then I'm really not doing a good job. But you have homework, my friend. You have homework. Yes, no frowning. I want you to take your camera outside, set that ISO at 400, just like what we did today. And I want you to manipulate the aperture and the shutter speed until you get the exposure meter right in the middle. Doesn't matter which one. You can choose, or you can mess around with both. But right now, I want you to work on getting the exposure meter in the middle and get that down. Because when you come back in the next video, then we're gonna work on focal distance, focal length, and then tap into a little bit of composition. Because that, and only that, is when you're gonna have a decision to make about which one you want to adjust. Whether the aperture, whether the shutter speed, or even the ISO. Sound good? See ya. One more thing. That is my best creation. He's mine. See? My videos may be terrible, my YouTube may be bad, but this guy right here is mine. He's my best creation. See, this is us at our baseball game. He got to yell out, "Play ball." He's pretty stoked about that, and so was I. And then this right here, I was growing my hair out to donate to cancer patients, and we were going to the premiere at the Myrtle Beach International Film Festival, where I won second place in a documentary that I created, first one I ever did, and I was pretty stoked about that. So anyway, a little tidbit in my life, but yeah, he's the best thing I've ever created, hands down. See ya.
Sé que tú quieres conmigo, amor, todos esos placeres que